Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our last workshop in the last day of this series of workshops as part of Qatar National Product Week. But I am sure we will finish on a very high note with our presenter, Mr. Khristo Ayad, the managing partner at Inistrat. Khristo is a senior communication consultant who's been in the Gulf region for over 15 years. He's previously held senior positions in multiple consultancy firms in Qatar and UAE. Part of these roles were to counsel multiple companies, international and local organizations on strategic communication and how to use that to drive business growth, awareness, and perception change. The topic for today's presentation is product differentiation. And during the next hour, Khristo will talk to us about how we can use strategic communication to differentiate products, what's the importance of product differentiation, and what it means to your business. As it is the format with all of our sessions, following the presentation, we will take Q&A. I encourage you to type your questions whenever you think of one in the Q&A tab, which you will see in the bottom of your screen. And Khristo will get to your questions once the presentation is over. Khristo, the screen is yours, and I'm looking forward to an exciting presentation.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. Thanks for taking the time. I hope that I can make it a little bit worthwhile. So the topic is product differentiation, but as Mr. Aziz just said, it's a little bit more than that, or it's a little bit different than that. We're going to talk about how communication can actually help to differentiate a business. It, of course, can't replace like an entire course on marketing and communication. So I had to distill a number of things. There is some technical information. Don't try to focus on that. I hope you can take away the main key messages out of this presentation, which basically should lead you to get what you want. So what are we talking about? Differentiation of products, services, or entire brands enables business to provide clients with superior value, right? Value is also something that can be quite subjective. Win-win constellations created that fosters a long-term profitability and viability. Don't worry, I'm not only going to read. These are the first few slides. Research identifies 6 dimensions of differentiation that are interrelated. There's different types of models, so I chose an easy one. The product, of course, what does your product have? How does it perform? What's the quality of it? How long do you grant warranty? That's one thing, right? What's the service? Customer service, right? Or, you know, like if you're a consulting business, how do you deliver? How do you train the client and your own people? Distribution or channels, you could say, that is basically how much coverage you have, maybe even internationally. It depends what product or services do you have, what experience do you bring to the table, how many offices do you have, and so on. The relationships that you are building, that could be a client relationship, it could be, you know, like just the way you are and deal with people. People often speak of a boutique experience. How reliable are you and how responsive are you? It's not exactly good style if you write an email and ask a question and you don't get an answer. Price, of course, that tops everything, right? You need to have good value at a good price. And the one thing that we want to talk about is reputation. A reputation is, of course, in like a perception. It is created in the minds of your audiences and the people that you are trying to talk to. In other words, reputation is the result of what you say, what you do, and what others say about you. Now, what you do is one thing. What you say and what others say about you is something we can look at. The power of the public nowadays, you know, everyone is an influencer, from the media to our children, to experts, and our friends, right? All the leadership in the big companies and governments, they know this already. And you can see here a few quotes that I listed. So how can we influence that? Through communication, strategic communication. There's a whole set of communications tools. We will touch on that a little bit later, but you should never forget, whatever it is, communication is one thing, but the way to actually get a good reputation is to be what you're trying to say, right? So if your product is bad, your communication can, of course, create a different perception, but that will only go that long, right? Communication supports your product, supports your services. And if you have something good to sell, then strong communication can help you a lot. On the other side, like if you have bad communication and a good product, you might actually be underperforming, which is what you don't want. So what is usually the so-called marketing and communications mix? Again, I'm repeating what I said. You can't replace an entire marketing communications course. So I put it here in one slide. In reality, these are all communication disciplines and channels that are used. So branding, so your visuals, your marketing, your advertising, your PR, and so on. Usually that is a bit divided by so-called below the line and above the line. In very short, I like to describe marketing is something, is a communication that you put out there above the line. It could be a billboard in which you have your ice cream that you're selling for $1.99. That's advertising / marketing. You put your message out there and let the people know. While public relations or strategic communications, which is overarching it all, basically creates a perception of this ice cream. So if you ask somebody on the street, what do you think of this person's ice cream or this company's ice cream? Their answer is influenced by public relations, but of course, mainly by the quality of your product. All of this can be happening in classical media. Classical media is, of course, your print, your newspapers, slowly dying away, your broadcast, radio and TV, but also news wires, which are a bit in fashion nowadays. You use press releases that are usually announcing news or giving a call to action, photo releases, much like nowadays where people don't like to read so much, but also longer articles, opinion pieces, interviews, editorials, etc. This can also be digital and online. All of these above can be digital and online. Careful, if you're talking about social media, you have a two-way communication, which is different. While if you are putting a press release out there, nobody can really answer in the immediate. If you have something like that on your Twitter account, then people can respond. And others, and this is basically everything else, your media familiarization tours, roundtables that can be very strategic. You invite journalists and thought leaders to speak together, awards, speaking opportunities for your spokespeople or your CEO. You organize press rooms, events, PR stunts, or even product placements in movies. If you can do that, there's a lot of that. Competition, sponsorship, etc. And then, of course, your marketing collateral, your brochures, your flyers, your activations, billboards, on-air advertising, but also off-air advertising, and so on. So as I said, I have like a few technical things, right? Don't focus too much on these slides. It's just important for you to know. So owned versus paid coverage or visibility, right? That's something that you need to have in mind when talking about communications, often mixed up somehow. Owned visibility is achieved by using a channel that you have created yourself, for example, your website, or you control. This could be your social media presences. Though careful, social media presences can be only controlled to a certain extent. This could be a company blog, a YouTube channel, or a corporate website, a Twitter account. In contrast to an owned website, controls limited on public platforms, as I said. Earned coverage, that's a typical public relations impact, is achieved by the media and or the public sharing content. So if you have, for example, an interview by your spokesperson and a journalist picks that up and quotes your spokesperson, that is earned coverage. It's nothing that you have to pay for. Usually you pay your public relations consultant for this if you have one. But in principle, this is something which is for free, which is often misunderstood. It also includes reactive media requests based on proactively dispatched content. So let's say you are sending out an opinion piece by your CEO on a certain topic, and a journalist finds that interesting and gets back to you and asks for another interview or further information. That will create you earned coverage, which is for free. Paid coverage is generated by third-party channels. So that's your typical marketing and advertising that can get very expensive, especially if you are on TV, etc. In very short, often mixed up tactics and strategy, right? And we'll get to more interesting things soon. We're gonna finish off the principles part. So a strategy is basically the underlying idea. It's an overall plan of what a plan that you are pursuing in order to achieve your objectives. Here you will have researched information, for example, on your audiences. We'll speak about audiences in a bit, and decision-making that governs your tactical implementation. Your tactics are the actual means, your channels, your vehicles, right? So for example, if your strategy is to create thought leadership, that you're seen as experts in your field, your spokespeople, maybe your engineers, whatever your company is doing, a vehicle for that would be an opinion piece in a newspaper. Depending on your target audience, it could be a newspaper, let's say in Qatar, if this is your target market, but also regional or international. It could be a trade media title, so specialized to engineering, for example. Objectives, right? There is no strategy in communications without defining your objectives. Often people forget. Creating a buzz is not an objective. Creating a buzz is just, like an idea, has almost pressure. You need to define it a little bit more. It can be all kinds of things, but usually you have 3 goals to make an impact. One is raising awareness, right? Maybe you have a product or a service or some kind of context that people don't know about, or it's somehow new. So you need to educate them first. Another one could be to change behaviors. Let's say you have a product or a service which goes contrary to what people are used to so far. You will have to change behaviors, but that's of course very rough. And of course, especially for businesses, to drive sales, right? All of these can be interrelated. Sometimes you want to drive sales. Let's say you have an ice cream to sell, which you have put a lot of effort into making the healthiest ice cream in the world. That's a marketing tagline. You would need to raise awareness, first of all, that ice cream is unhealthy. You would need to maybe change behaviors that people would buy an ice cream that tastes different, and that would drive your sales. That's of course very, very minimalistic and would require usually much more time to discuss. Your audiences, if you sell ice cream, you would have to think about who buys that and who's important for you. An example of how you could map that out, right, would be like that. You're basically clustering this a little bit. There are audiences that could be critical for success or important for success, and audiences that are not important. Some that are high stakeholder concern and low stakeholder concern. Again, this is an example because I don't know what we are selling at this point, right? So for example, you have your targeted age or professional groups, your potential clients, maybe the company leadership that is financing your research and that is financing your salaries until you actually break even. Maybe policymakers, maybe you're selling a product or a service that requires a change in legislation in a country or where you are or in another country. The industry community, if you have something which is interesting for a particular professional community, you need them to talk about it. Your local community, if this is your target audience, maybe a little bit lower. It could be, of course, also on a higher critics in the local community, particularly in Qatar, that can be sometimes a topic. Other related entities, possible partners that you will have in the future, influencers, potential clients, parents. So if you're talking about ice cream again, it could be the parents or the grandparents that are important to convince because they will have to pay a higher price, for example. Again, this is just an example to illustrate that. Most importantly, communicators that make great impact, they know that it's not about them. The communicator needs to know that it's not about him or her. It's about the audiences. The audiences will always ask, what's in it for me? And that also sometimes requires that you get out of your comfort zone and explain something in a totally different way. Let's say you are an engineer or your product is engineering relevant or somehow technical. You need to be able to translate that for an audience that it is relevant to. So what makes an impactful communicator? The communicator that really gets what he wants, puts the human at the center of his communication. That means that he is trying to think, and here's the main takeaway of today's presentation, to think of how the audiences feel, their thoughts, their passions, their fears, their desires, their interests. The communicator leaves the comfort zone of what they know, the specialist. So let's say you're selling ice cream and you have like a wonderful chemical formula of how you actually did this and the different ingredients there that nobody can understand. That's not what you're going to talk about. And you should leave that comfort zone and try find out what the audience wants to know about. So your audience, the relevance for your audience, which is their emotions and their standpoints and their mindsets. And you need to know what you want. That goes back to your objectives. So a good communicator knows his audiences, he knows what's relevant to his audiences, and he knows what he wants. All right? It's about your audiences again. You have to make sense and share sense. It's very often so that complicated information doesn't make sense to somebody who is, let's say, not educated in the same field or not interested in the same field. If I want to buy, let's say, a very sophisticated new power tool, for me, it's important how much does it cost, how does it work, how will it help me? I don't need to know all the engineering innovations there. Communication is not only about sending a message. It's about your message making a meaning to someone in that very moment. Information alone is not communication. What you send is not necessarily what is understood. That already starts with language, but it's often also in like a different level of perception, a different level of education, but also just a different standpoint. If you sell ice cream, it's different if you sell it to the children, to the parents, to the grandparents. They all have different standpoints at that point of time. Communication is about making a connection between you and your target audience. The meaning of what you are saying is created in people, not in your words. Not necessarily what you're saying is what is arriving. It is something that you have to be very careful about. Emotional connection is achieved by listening first. Listening, in other words, you need to do your research on what is the case in your market. Paying attention to your audience and adapting your messages accordingly. Successful communicators, as I mentioned before, they resonate with their audience because they're relevant, because they make them feel what they want is important. Solid communications always integrates research to understand what it is that will resonate best. Along with your facts, strategic communications will centrally consider the audience's emotions to achieve its objectives. Here's an example of a great communicator. Also, a US president has something to sell, right? Bob Dylan said about Barack Obama, he makes you think and feel in the same time. It's a good example. We'll have some more. So there are verbal and non-verbal messages. An example for non-verbal messages was when Apple first introduced the iPad in 2010. Steve Jobs, of course, one of the master communicators, sat on his stage in a sofa with the iPad in hand, with his jeans and his t-shirt, demonstrating how this new device is actually working. Relaxing and watching TV. He didn't speak anything at that moment, right? But it was already clear that if you sit like that, and this is the setup in which you use this new device, it is not intended for work, it is for home and pleasure. Verbal messages, and these are of course important. In public relations, we often speak about key messages, and the secret of this is that you repeat them. The more often you repeat them, the better. They need to be as short as possible, right? Especially if you're in the commercial sector. So Apple did that. They made Twitter-friendly, chunked, and very emotive messages. Jobs' iPad headlines were descriptive, tangible, and short, meaning fitting in 140 characters of a tweet, right? So the iPad was at the time introduced as the most advanced technology in a magical and revolutionary device. Magical and revolutionary. Remember, all of this was new at the time, this type of interface, at an unbelievable price. These are three key messages. So that is 12 years ago, right? Or even longer. So it's usually so that these three key messages, magical, revolutionary, at an unbelievable price, will be still existing today. If you Google it, it's worth an experiment. We made the buttons look so good, you'll want to lick them. That's what he said, right? It couldn't get more emotional than that. He tried to speak to people on that level. And as you know, I mean, the iPad and all following products are extremely successful. And I really believe it has something to do with the way they sold it. Of course, it's also a very good product. What actually matters when you communicate? And that may surprise you. Of course, 100% is your message, right? So you want to say something. I have the best ice cream, the most healthy ice cream in the world. If this is 100%, then 50% of that is emotional and visual. So already 50% of what you are saying is actually resonating on the emotional and visual level. 30% is already the sound of your voice. So that's important for people on TV or on radio, etc. But also if you're actually in a boardroom presenting, or if you're sitting like me here and presenting, or even speaking to somebody or to your team, etc. And only 7% are your facts. Now, careful, that doesn't mean that your facts are irrelevant. You should have 7% of hard facts that are really making sense and that differentiate your product. So if your ice cream is supposed to be the healthiest in the world, then you need to also be able to prove it. Maybe scientific studies can show that less children get sick in winter when eating this ice cream as opposed to other ice cream, and so on, right? I'm simplifying it quite a lot, right? So in other words, and now this is a trap, right? Impact equals your message, what you want to say, plus the human factor. Is that correct? Well, now we're not in a classroom, so I can't ask you. It is not correct. In fact, impact is message times your human factor. That is how the formula goes. Now, the human factor, to actually unearth that and realize what that is. How do people feel and what do they want? What do they fear at this point of time? what's in it for them, how much can they afford, how much do they understand. That requires a lot of research. So it's quite difficult to actually get that. It's as opposed to just creating a buzz, right? Creating a buzz is not a good objective to formulate. You need to be targeted. But the good news is, if you can increase the human factor only by a little bit because it's multiplied or multiplying your message, your impact is much, much higher. So this is your takeaway. Your message must be multiplied by your human factor. Here's a classic example that some of you may know. I find it always very interesting to look at these examples in history. In 1929, public relations as such, or marketing communications, was still a new thing, right? At that time, it was actually not well seen if women would smoke or even smoke in public. American Tobacco Company, with the objective to sell, turned to at the time, brand new public relations firm to explore how they can sell cigarettes to women. So they started doing their research, and they realized that Lucky Strike, which was an American tobacco brand at the time, had a green packaging, and that most of the women found it ugly. It had put women off buying them, as green wasn't desirable to them. So the green packaging was deemed too expensive to replace. Of course, you could make it blue or whatever, right? But they looked at it, they found it's too expensive. So they turned it around. The answer to that was, let's make green, especially the particular green of Lucky Strike, the premier color of the fashion season. Fashion designers were convinced to do a fashion show in the Waldorf Astoria and do a green gala for some of the, like the trendy people at the time. And they changed the perception of the color green, that specific color green that was used in Lucky Strikes. Here's some examples, right? You can see how everything is now dipped in this green color, and suddenly it's all very fashionable and nice and cool. That also goes along with the perception at the time that cigarettes were actually keeping a woman slim. You can see that here, to keep a slender figure. No one can deny the level of knowledge at the time was a different one. We'll speak about that in a bit as well. Now, this public relations firm that they turned to was actually established by a guy called Edward Bernays. Edward Bernays is often described as the father of PR. One could argue about that, but he was certainly one of the first. The interesting thing about him was, and that's the gentleman here on the bottom right, that he was a nephew of Sigmund Freud, the gentleman here on the left, the great psychoanalyst that came up with a lot of theories in psychotherapy, psychoanalysis. And the public relations ideas at the time developed by Edward Bernays were based on psychology and ideas from psychoanalytics. Our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested. If you think about this closely, there's a lot of truth to that. Now, what became famous though in public relations history is how this campaign on cigarettes went further. So American Tobacco Company felt they didn't sell enough cigarettes to women in particular. So they turned to the public relations industry. They said, okay, let's change the perception of the color green. So they went further. Bernays consulted a psychiatrist, a guy called Brill, who was a student of his uncle. And he asked him exactly that question. What is the psychological basis for a woman's desire to smoke? Right? At the time, it was a taboo. It was not well seen. But then research on the psychology level found out that cigarettes are equated to men, right? It's something that was perceived as male. So if you change the perception of that, because women felt suppressed and basically disadvantaged towards men, they changed the narrative from if you smoke a cigarette, which is usually equated with men, you can actually make a statement of your freedom. Bernays linked Lucky Strike cigarettes to the women's liberation movement and staged a demonstration at the 1929 Easter Parade, having fashionable young women photographed with their cigarettes, their torches of freedom, Lucky Strike cigarettes. The brand was then actually made a symbol of gender equality in the US. That's of course in 1929, but why I'm saying this is because it shows that it has catered to a certain emotional state and a certain mindset at a certain time. So if you look at your audiences, you want to differentiate your product, your business, or your brand, you need to think exactly in the same way. What are my target audiences thinking today? What do they want? And how can my product, my service, my brand fit in there? Unfortunately, there's not many good pictures of this event, but you can find these older historical documents of women smoking. That at the time was a revolution, unbelievable, unheard of, right? Another tool, of course, is credibility, of course. So if you say, and I'm using that example again, that your ice cream is the healthiest in the world, it doesn't really make sense if you say that alone and your background is, let's say you are a lawyer, right? Because what does a lawyer know about healthy ice cream? So usually you would try find maybe a scientist that helped develop the ice cream, or somebody from the health authority in the country that you're selling it, that is reporting on the studies on this ice cream, and then basically confirms that this is a healthy ice cream. It makes it credible. An endorsement of an expert makes it credible. That's in every field, by the way. I'm just like always boiling it down to this ice cream example because it's maybe the simplest. But also that is depending on the context. As I mentioned before, it is, who is your spokesperson? Is he credible in the area that he speaks about? Or she? The level of education in your audience, right? So if you think about something like vaccinations and the corona crisis, it was in parts like so scientific that, you know, like most of the people in the audience, they just needed to trust what is being said, because of course not everybody is a virologist, all right? Level of knowledge in the public about a certain topic. So if you come up with something completely new, then you will maybe have to explain from scratch. A good example would be all kinds of environmental friendly technologies nowadays, solar technology, alternative water irrigation systems, and things like that, that people just don't know much about, and very often also don't really know what the sense is of these. Also depending on the country, right? In Europe, where energy is significantly more expensive, the perception and the pressure is different than, for example, in the Gulf. Level of knowledge in a country, and the level of knowledge in a certain time. So here's an example. There was a time when smoking was considered healthy, and the endorsements came from doctors, and really in very forward looking campaigns. Look at this.
You know, if you were to follow a busy doctor as he makes his daily round of calls, you'd find yourself having a mighty busy time keeping up with him. Time out for many men of medicine usually means just long enough to enjoy a cigarette. And because they know what a pleasure it is to smoke a mild, good-tasting cigarette, they're particular about the brand they choose. In a repeated national survey, doctors in all branches of medicine, doctors in all parts of the country were asked, "What cigarette do you smoke, doctor?" Once again, the brand named most was Camel. Yes, according to this repeated nationwide survey, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. Why not change to Camels for the next 30 days and see what a difference it makes in your smoking enjoyment? See how Camels agree with your throat. See how mild and good tasting a cigarette can be.
So you can see, and these things are rather astonishing, right? In summary, a good communicator tries to find a connection to his or her audiences, to what they feel, and tries to cater to them. Remember, it's not about you, it's about them. And your audience will always ask, what's in it for me? And this is what you need to answer. And to finish this off, I would be very interested to also have your take and your thoughts on this question. Which emotions do we have to consider in Qatar? So of course, there's different interests, different things, different products that need to be differentiated. But of course, it's different if you're selling something in Germany, where I'm from, or in Qatar. The emotional situation, the mindset, the culture, etc., are different. I make it a point to think about these things as well. As you know, communication here happens different than in other countries. The Majlis is a central point of exchange of information. So with certain topics, you actually want to be talked about in a Majlis. Social media plays a huge role here. The growth rates of social media here are higher than in Europe, and so on. So I'm hoping to have this discussion. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Khristo. It's been a pleasure listening to your presentation, watching your presentation. I have to say, personally, as someone who works in the field, this is extremely insightful and a well-rounded presentation. So thank you very much for putting this together. If anyone has questions, this is the time, and you can type your questions in the Q&A tab as always, and Khristo will be answering them. Muhammad Musallam is saying great information. Thank you, Muhammad. Well, one thing to start with, I think you made us all crave ice cream. So if the ice cream sales in Doha jumped a bit today or later, that's because of the presentation. I'm gonna kick off with let's say a question or a point that caught my attention a lot, and that is the non-verbal messages. And you bringing Steve Jobs as an example, I think is brilliant, because honestly, before Steve Jobs, you couldn't think of a lot of a typical look and feel or body language or a way of dressing of the tech entrepreneur. I mean, there were tech entrepreneurs, there were tech innovators. IBM was there, Microsoft, but he gave the whole thing a different dimension. And then after Steve Jobs, now everybody, has their own. So they're either athletic or down to earth or something. Is that, in your opinion, part of the non-verbal messaging? Portraying that character.
Yes, absolutely. It's part of your visual language, and it actually permeates into absolutely everything, right? If you think of the Marlboro Man, right? Of course, there was also messages, but the Marlboro Man was, of course, a free, very masculine, very adventurous guy. So was the Camel Man, of course, these type of things play a role. But also nowadays with CEOs, they are looking at creating and having their own brand and to be seen in a certain way. Elon Musk is a perfect example as well. He dresses in a certain way, he behaves in a certain way, whether you agree with it or not. And he's certainly wealthy enough to not care. because he has achieved a lot. He has a lot of facts, these 7%, but of course the perception of him is still there. So yes, I believe it's a huge part of it.
And will you say, I mean, in the case of Steve Jobs, the example you showed us in I think it was the iPad launch, this were the later years of Steve Jobs. I mean, it was very well established by the time.
Yeah.
Apple was a giant. But I mean, in the case of Elon Musk, for example, does he portray this character?
Yeah.
In your opinion, based on research that shows his audience will like that, or do leaders or people at that level lead and others follow? I mean, I'm curious to know. Is that part of the product positioning? In the sense. Yeah.
No, I think it's a combination of good instinct. And Steve Jobs obviously had good instinct. I don't know if you've read his book. He had a very good instinct also for people and who to hire. He was not an easy person, but he was an instinctive person. But of course, he also had an amazing team. So yes, there was research done, and this type of presentation format, the messaging, they tested their messages, they adapted them to be Twitter friendly, to be emotive. So it's a combination of both. Of course, like nowadays, and you may know this this formula, the communications department of a company is seen as the fifth chair. It's part of the management. In really big ones, you have a chief communications officer. These are very strategic people reporting directly to a CEO, and there's an exchange there, speaking on eye level. So Steve Jobs, yes, he had a good instinct. He was a decision maker. He was also not so horizontal, so he was always having the last word. However, he definitely had a very good team working on design, working on messaging, working on tactics and strategy, etc. And as we know, it worked very well. So to answer your question, I think a little bit of it can be instinctively achieved coincidence, and it just falls into place. But there is always planning. Good communications doesn't work without good planning and research. You need to know what you're doing.
Okay, that was my setup question to my follow-up question, which is a lot of times, I think you come across also this. You sit with a client who is looking to differentiate themselves, and all of a sudden, part of the brief comes that we would want to be the next Google or the next Apple or the next Tesla or this or that. And as admirable and aspirational that might be, I think what you just told us is don't be the next anything, because you're not necessarily talking to the same people. You're not talking to the same audience. So even the Teslas, the Googles, the Apples, and all of these people, they did not copy each other. They actually went through the process that you talked about, right? To differentiate themselves.
Yes. That's a very good question. And I would always say, try to find your own position, try to find your own brand. Of course, nowadays people speak about innovation, and sometimes very hard to know what innovation is, but there are amazing people who come up with unbelievable things. But sometimes they're just similar, right? And sometimes like a certain business, let's say an online distributor or an online sales platform is currently very, very well running. So people start, I wouldn't want to say copying, but creating their own versions of it. So then, of course, it gets a little bit more difficult because they might speak to a similar or even the same target audience. But I think it's very important for everyone to find their own identity. However, there are examples where the objectives might be purely sales driven, where all of this is not necessarily. I give you an example. One of the most valuable brands, not only in the perception of people, or not only in terms of money, but also in terms of the perception of that exists in people is Rolex, right? Rolex is, as you know, a Swiss watch brand which exists since I think almost 100 years or something, right? Which has become hugely aspirational. And the interesting thing is that they have watches that are unchanged in terms of design. Maybe in terms of technical features they have developed, but the design has been the same in the past 60 years. Nowadays, there are Rolexes that are costing a certain amount of money in the shop, but they are always so rare that you can't find them. So people will pay for it in the used market, double and triple the price, right? So it becomes like this huge aspirational thing. I want to have one. So they can be a brand that actually creates a similar watch, let's say, right? And if you'd consult them, you know, like you would probably tell them, and their offering is basically we are selling something similar at a lower price at a good quality. So you would not tell them try copy them, try find your own route, but don't put so much effort into that because it's very clear you're selling something similar. The main target here is sales. That's something I can talk about for ages. Very interesting.
Which goes back to the third, let's say, element of your strategy, which is, or the first, which is your objective. If your objective is to simply, so there is no need to be innovative when your objective is not to be innovative. Now, I wanna use the remaining time just to make this the most out of this session by asking you about. So we talked about a lot of great examples and a global overview, strategic overview of communication and brand and product differentiation. For local startups, local SMEs, local products in Qatar, in this specific context, knowing that when you're new, you're doing a million things, juggling a lot of balls. Can you think of some of the tools, and I hate to use the word hacks, I'm using it very conservatively here, but when a business cannot afford a consultant or a strategic approach, or maybe they're under pressure of time to go to the market, what are the most important things you can tell to this kind of audience? What are the basics that they should do, and then later on they can fix the strategic approach if they have to do that?
So in other words, you're talking of a brand that wants to sell locally. You're talking of a brand that has limited budget and can't think strategically. Well, it's not so. Like let's face it, right? It is not so.
Sorry, not can't think strategically, but you know, under certain pressure, are not thinking strategically now.
Exactly. See, again, you know, like there's different levels of research that you can do, right? And you don't have to have a PhD or a master's. What you need to know is that your audience is important. It makes sense. There are tools, there are free tools where you can actually start having a dipstick analysis. You can, you know, like invite a few journalists for, you know, like a small event or something if your budget is limited, and start speaking to them. Hey, what do people in the market think about this type of product or this segment of the market? You can do a lot of these things yourself and try create on your own. Now, of course, you know, like a consultant is a consultant and is paid because he has experience and also particularly experience in a certain product. I would, for example, never recommend somebody in the commercial space to work with, let's say, a political analyst in because he has a different expertise, even if he's also in communications, right? But yeah, well, basically, my advice is try do a lot of things yourself, learn as you do, but also, and you know, like that's like a shameless plug-in. There's a lot of people here in the local market that work for rates that should actually be looked at.
Fair enough. I think the idea here is, the most important idea is, if something looks complex and difficult and expensive, don't just shy away from it. Try to do the work because it's important. I'm asking this because we often hear this a lot, like we are not big, so we don't need to be strategic. And in my opinion, it's the other way around, because big companies can afford mistakes.
Yes.
Startups and smaller and local producers, local products, local brands cannot afford mistakes.
Yes.
The margin for error is small, so you need to be strategic. And even as you said, not to overcomplicate the term strategy.
Yep.
Just look at 3 simple things, understand your audience, your objectives, and your
Yep.
audience mindset, and you'll be on the right, let's say, path. And then, of course, as you go, you need to consider a lot of other things.
Yes. In a nutshell, that can be summarized like that.
That's I think it's important that we say that to the local companies, because we are, at the end of the day, doing this as part of the Qatar National Product Week. And you mentioned the Majlis in your presentation. I personally think it's an excellent research tool at everybody's hand here in Qatar, because you have a nice representative sample of the society, and
Sure.
usually it's friendly. You can ask questions. Do you agree? And do you have any experience with that? Just to
Sure. Yeah. Well, I am fortunate enough to go to majlises on a regular basis. I have many Qatari friends, and of course, like the information, like I don't want to, like it's of course just a get together, just like when we get together to have a coffee, right? But of course, why I mentioned it is because it's a point where things are being discussed on a local level, where things are also criticized on a local level, where things are criticized in a different language and with a different cultural premise. And for certain services and products that may be important to you, it really depends on what it is that you have to sell, or what it is that you have to raise awareness about or change behaviors about. That is a very important part. And as you know, the Majlis here has a huge influence on the actual society, and with that, the actual society has a huge influence also on the rest of the people, which are the expats, even if they sometimes tend to live in some kind of parallel universe, right?
Yeah. I have a question from Abdullah, who's saying, related to the considered emotional question. So that's about your audience emotions. Abdullah says, I believe that trust is taking a main role in every
Yes.
single detail in terms
Yes.
of advertising content or sales point of view. So what do you have to comment on that? It's not a question, it's a contribution.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there is actually research by a large company called Edelman. They come out with their yearly report, and they regularly find out that trust is one of the most important values when it comes to product differentiation, in their case, service differentiation and their brand. And yes, absolutely, especially, and maybe here is something which is very Qatar specific, in a market that is so small as here, right? Here you really need to judge the people not by what they say, but by what they do and what they deliver. And if you fail too often, right, then this will not look good on you, and your reputation will go down, and your product will not be seen well, or your service. So yes, trust is extremely important, and I would even personally agree with that. I'd rather pay even a higher price for the same service or product from somebody that I trust, because I know he's ethical, he's reliable, he's knowledgeable, and he also tells me if he doesn't know. I think it's, like trust also requires honesty. So if you don't know something, just say so, and maybe you like hire an expert in that field or become an expert in that field, right?
Thank you so much, Khristo. I trust this will be the best way or the perfect way to conclude our conversation. And I want to thank you so much for your time, for sharing your knowledge and expertise, and for being an absolute amazing presenter. I want to thank the audience and everyone who's been with us throughout the week. And have a good day, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.